Welcome, weary traveler. Settle in, let your breath soften, and allow your thoughts to drift back through the sepia-toned folds of history. Tonight, we'll take a slow and gentle journey into the everyday world of a figure draped in quiet authority, the sheriff of the American Wild West. This is not the wild gallop of adventure, nor the clamor of gunfire. There will be no quick-draw duels or lawless raids under moonlight. No. Instead, imagine yourself standing beneath the soft, hazy sun of a late afternoon. The wooden planks of a boardwalk creak under your boots. Dust lifts gently in the breeze and settles again like sleep itself. This is the world, as it truly was not a theatre of chaos, but a place of long days, quiet watchfulness, and quiet burdens. We'll move slowly through the rhythms of this life. The sounds of hoofbeats, the scent of horses, the measured steps of justice, the daily routine of a man who balanced duty and fatigue, ideals and compromises. Close your eyes if you'd like. Breathe evenly. Let the quiet stories unfold, like old papers taken from a desk drawer. The sun always rose early in those frontier towns, and so did the sheriff. In the crisp quiet of dawn, the sheriff's boots touched the packed earth outside his modest quarters, often adjacent to the jailhouse or sharing space with a general store or the saloon. The scent of strong black coffee wafted from tin mugs, steam rising lazily in the cool air. Mornings were the sheriff's only real moment of calm. The day ahead would not usually begin with gunfights or arrests. More often, it started with paperwork. At a small pine wood, desk stained with age, and scuffed at the corners, the sheriff would log the previous day's events in a ledger. A stolen horse here, a drunken scuffle there, perhaps a notice from the circuit judge regarding a trial 2 weeks hence. Even in the most remote settlements, the need for records remained steady. Justice, as it turned out, was quite bureaucratic. Next came rounds. The sheriff would walk or ride through town, greeting merchants unlocking their shops, tipping his hat to passing ladies with parasols, or pausing to check on the blacksmith as he kindled his forge. This was not simply social, it was presence. In towns where fear of lawlessness always hovered just beyond the edges of the horizon, the visibility of law and order was calming, even symbolic. Mid-morning often brought minor disturbances. A gambler accusing another of cheating at cards. A cowhand who'd spent the night too deep in a bottle, now shouting in the street. The sheriff's approach, however, was rarely forceful. Calm talk, steady gaze, a hand resting lightly near the holster but never reaching it was usually enough. In truth, the sheriff's most valuable weapon was not the six-shooter at his side, but his voice firm, level, practiced in the art of de-escalation. Meals were simple. Salt pork, hard biscuits, beans cooked slowly over coals. On better days, perhaps fresh eggs or a slice of apple pie from the boarding house. Meals were eaten quickly, alone or in the company of a deputy if one was appointed. Some towns were too small to afford a deputy, leaving the sheriff to wear all hats: lawman, clerk, jailer, mediator. Afternoons brought the sun high and harsh, baking the dust into the streets and drawing sweat even from the stillest posture. It was during these hours that the sheriff might patrol the outskirts. He might ride along the fence lines of nearby ranches, or follow a trail reported to have shown signs of horse thieves. Sometimes these reports proved baseless phantoms of dust and nervous minds. Other times, they led to long rides and longer nights. Evening settled slowly in the west, marked by the long shadows cast across the clapboard facades of buildings and the amber light flickering from saloon windows. The sheriff would usually sit on a wooden chair outside his office, watching the flow of townsfolk go about their business. Laughter, piano music, the clink of glasses, these sounds filled the air as people sought respite from the day. It was not uncommon for disturbances to arise after dark. A fight spilling out from the saloon, someone firing a shot in the air to impress a companion, or a stranger arriving on horseback with unknown intentions. The sheriff would rise slowly, with the practiced patience of one who has faced many such moments. No rush, no panic, just presence. And then, before retiring for the night, he would walk the jail cells, check the locks, offer a blanket, maybe exchange a word with a remorseful prisoner, or none at all. The door would close softly behind him, boots would come off, the cot would creak, and another day, in the long, steady rhythm of a Wild West sheriff, would draw to a close. Outside, coyotes might cry in the distance, but in town, all would be still again, As we move further into the layered folds of this quiet frontier life, let us turn our attention to a single manor sheriff, whose name has drifted into legend, but whose true story is one of complexity, solitude, and weariness. This is the story of Sheriff Pat Garrett. Not born into violence, nor drawn by glory, Patrick Floyd Garrett entered the world in Alabama in 1850. He would live much of his early life surrounded not by gunpowder or conflict, but by the sounds of livestock, the labor of hands tilling the land, and the slow migration of families westward. His upbringing was ordinary, in many wayside work, modest means, and a restless curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. Eventually, Garrett found his way to the New Mexico territory. There, the landscape stretched wide and silent, dotted by low mesquite and the tracks of distant stagecoaches. He worked as a buffalo hunter first, then a bartender, before quietly stepping into the role that would come to define him, lawman. In 1880, at the age of 30, Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County. This was no small county. It spanned over 4,000 square miles of rugged hills, dusty plains, and scattered settlements. With a newly minted badge and steady nerves, Garrett assumed his position with a sense of duty, yet he could not have known the weight it would carry. At the time, the region simmered with tension. A young outlaw, known simply as Billy the Kid, had gained both notoriety and a peculiar kind of fame. Some called him a criminal. Others saw in him a symbol of rebellion, even a folk hero. Garrett had known him before, back when they were both younger, before lines were drawn between law and lawlessness. Their eventual encounter would become legend, but in the telling, something essential is often lost. Garrett's pursuit of Billy the Kid was not the stuff of silver screen thrillers. It was slow, grueling work-gathering intelligence, following rumors, and riding endless miles across desert trails. When the final meeting came in Fort Sumner in 1881, it was not a dramatic duel at high noon. It was quiet, almost silent. Garrett, hidden in the shadows, fired a single shot. Billy fell, and the room was still again. Though the killing ended the chase, it began a different kind of burden. Garrett was lauded by some, vilified by others. He would pen a book about the kid, perhaps seeking to control the narrative, or perhaps merely to make peace with it. But the fame he earned brought little comfort. Garrett's later years were a mixture of politics, failed business ventures, and growing isolation. He served as a customs collector, a rancher, even a hired investigator. Yet the shadows of his choices never quite lifted. Towns changed. Railroads pushed deeper into the frontier. The West grew quieter, but not easier. In 1908, on a lonely stretch of road near Las Cruces, Garrett was shot and killed under circumstances that remain murky. Perhaps it was a dispute, perhaps revenge. Some even whispered about land deals gone wrong, but the end, like much of his life, was cloaked in ambiguity. Garrett's story is not one of unbroken heroism. It is the story of a man caught between two worlds, the fading past of open-range justice and the encroaching order of a new century. His badge may have been metal, but the weight it bore was human. He was not a myth. He was not a legend. He was just a man who rose each morning to carry out his duty, and who, like many sheriffs of his time, lived a life of quiet resolve. Let us move now from the known to the half-known, to mysteries buried beneath the dust of forgotten towns. As the footsteps of our sheriff fade into twilight, let your mind drift deeper still, beyond the ledger books and wanted posters, beyond the final gunshots and newspaper reports, into the quiet silence of places left behind. All across the American West, there remain ghost towns, fragile, sun-bleached skeletons of once bustling frontier communities. Their buildings lean gently with age. Shutters rattle in the wind. Rusted hinges creak on doors no longer opened. These towns are whisper-chaunted not by phantoms, but by time. And in some of them, strange traces of long-forgotten sheriffs remain. In Coloma, California, for instance, the remains of a tiny jailhouse still stand. Within its walls, archaeologists discovered a brass star tucked into the dust between floorboards, its inscription too worn to read. Nearby, a faded logbook held pages so brittle they disintegrated with the lightest touch. The names within are gone. Only faint ink shadows remain. Was it the sheriff's badge? A deputy's? Or perhaps left behind in haste, in fear, as the town fell quiet after the gold ran dry? In southern Arizona, the town of Charleston once pulsed with saloons, gambling halls, and the restless energy of miners. But today, it's almost entirely erased by wind and sand. Yet, from beneath that earth, historians have recovered a peculiar assortment of objects: a Colt revolver, never fired, a sheriff's hatband, and a set of iron keys, likely to a cell block now lost to collapse. There are no records of who wore that hatband, no names tied to those keys. The past, it seems, keeps its secrets close. Other mysteries are subtler still. In the Montana Territory, old stone cairns dot the hillsides around Banneker Boomtown turned relic. For years, locals assumed these were boundary markers, but ground-penetrating radar in recent years revealed the outline of structures near them, possibly rudimentary outposts used by marshals or sheriffs overseeing territorial disputes. No documents confirm their use, but the way they align with footpaths and streams suggests patterns of patrol, of vigilance. Culture, too, leaves its imprintless tangible, but no less real. In small frontier churches, sermons often reference the sheriff not as a mere official, but as a moral compass, a symbol of divine justice amid wilderness. One pastor in 1883 wrote, "The sheriff is the visible arm of right action, where courts are slow and sin rides fast." Such words elevate the role beyond legality into something mythic, almost ceremonial. Yet, paradoxically, in some towns, the sheriff was seen with suspicion. Local law in parts of New Mexico speaks of sheriffs who vanished under mysterious circumstances, some possibly run out by corrupt townsfolk, others swallowed by the desert after failing to enforce unpopular laws. Even in artifacts, contradictions arise. A tin badge recovered near Deadwood, South Dakota, bore the image of a starrand beneath it, etched with what appeared to be a knife. The phrase, "Not for me." Was it a resignation? A protest? A mark left by one who refused the weight of justice? So much of this history is like soft ash present, but impossible to grasp fully. Yet in every fragment, in every warped doorframe and silent cell, there lingers the echo of those who once watched the streets, rode the lonely trails, and answered to no sound louder than their own conscience. As we leave behind these silent mysteries, let us now return to the people who walked those same dusty paths. Not the sheriffs, but the world they governed. The sheriff's world, though often quiet, unfolded against a backdrop of contrasted, delicate interplay between power and poverty, ambition and survival, civilization and the edge of wilderness. To understand the full measure of a sheriff's role, one must consider the society he moved through, not only the outlaws he pursued, but the townsfolk he served, and the privileged few he often answered to. At the heart of many frontier towns was a core of modest, hard-working citizens. Farmers, ranchers, smiths, shopkeepers, people whose lives were ruled by necessity. Their homes were simple, 1 or 2 rooms, their walls often constructed of sod, adobe, or rough-hewn timber. The air within carried the scent of oil lamps, worn leather, and whatever meal simmered over the stove. For these residents, the sheriff was less a lawman of legend and more a neighbor. He might help mend a fence after a storm, deliver news from town, or lend his horse to a family in need. His presence offered comfort-proof that order, however fragile, still held. But just as prominent were those who held sway from above: the wealthy ranchers, land speculators, and local politicians. Dressed in tailored coats and fine hats, they dined in the few buildings graced with wallpaper and chandeliers, and often shaped town policy from behind saloon doors. Their influence reached deep into law enforcement. A sheriff who displeased the local elite might find his funding reduced, his authority questioned, or his re-election quietly opposed. And so, the sheriff walked a careful line. He had to appear just, yet not disruptive. He needed to quell disturbances without angering the powerful. If a ranch hand caused trouble in town, swift action was expected. But if the ranch owner's son caused the same disruption, the response was often more delicate. A quiet word, a second chance, averted eyes. This balancing act extended beyond class. The social structure of these towns was also defined by race, nationality, and gender, each carrying its own set of injustices, often unchallenged. In towns along the border or near railroad camps, Chinese immigrants, Mexican laborers, and formerly enslaved African Americans worked tirelessly in mines, kitchens, laundries, and stables. Their grievances, when brought before the sheriff, were not always given equal weight. Biases, both cultural and codified, shaped the administration of justice. For women, the law offered protection in name, but little in practice. Domestic violence, for example, was rarely prosecuted, viewed instead as a private matter. A sheriff might intervene, but only if compelled by public outcry or personal conviction. Yet despite these limits, there were moments of humanity. There are recorded instances of sheriffs who went against the grain, who defended landless farmers against powerful cattle barons, or who stood in court to testify on behalf of women wronged by influential men. But these were exceptions, not norms, and they came with risk. In truth, the sheriff's role was never entirely clean nor entirely corrupt. It lived in shades of dust-grey morality. He was both servant and enforcer, both protector and politician. He watched over a world where a man's handshake might bind a deal, but where a man's life might still be claimed for the price of a poker hand. And through all of it, he remained boots scuffed, shoulders square, eyes scanning the street not for glory, but for the fragile thread of order he was sworn to hold. As we ease further into this delicate tapestry of frontier life, let us turn our gaze now toward the tools of the trade, the quiet implements of law, and the symbols that gave the sheriff his authority. In the low light of a sheriff's office, where shadows stretched long across the floorboards and dust floated like motes of thought, there rested the simple objects that defined his work. These were not grand artifacts of power, but humble tools, quiet companions in the daily, steady march of order. At the heart of the sheriff's authority was his badge, typically a 5 or 6-pointed star. The badge was often made of stamped tin or brass. Some bore the name of the county, others only the word sheriff etched in blocky letters. Rarely ornate, these emblems were utilitarian, pinned to vests or coats already worn thin by the sun and wind. And yet, this small piece of metal carried immense symbolic weight. The badge was visible proof of trust granted by the people, enforced by the law. In towns where memory was long and tempers were short, it served as both shield and target. It granted access to saloons and courtrooms alike, but could also invite danger. Wearing the badge marked a man as both peacekeeper and enforcer. As one sheriff once wrote, "The badge brings respect until it doesn't." Beside the badge was the revolver. Though often mythologized, the sheriff's sidearm was not his primary method of justice. Most sheriffs preferred to resolve conflict without drawing steel. The Colt single-action army revolver, known simply as the Peacemaker, was standard issue by the 1870s. It held 6 rounds and rested comfortably in a low-slung holster. Worn smooth from years of use, it was rarely drawn in haste. Many sheriffs carried rifles as well, especially when riding long distances outside of town. The Winchester Model 1873 was a favored choice light, durable, and capable of firing rapidly if necessary. But again, these were tools of last resort. The sheriff's real power lay not in his firepower, but in his posture, his tone, and his understanding of people. Then there were the handcuff simple iron restraints, often handmade or forged by the town's blacksmith. Crude by modern standards, they served their purpose, though escape was not unheard of. More often, rope was used, tied firmly around wrists or looped through saddle horns during prisoner transport. Other tools were even less conspicuous. A pocket notebook, used to jot down names, dates, sightings. A set of wanted posters, thumbtacked to the wall or rolled in a satchel. A tin whistle, in some towns used to summon help. And keys, each one unique to its cell, dangling from a ring that clinked softly with every step. The sheriff's desk was a study in controlled clutter. Stacks of paper tied with string, a bottle of ink, a penknife for trimming quills, and sometimes in the drawer, a flask used sparingly, or too often depending on the man. The jailhouse itself was both workplace and symbol. Often built of adobe, stone or heavy timber, it contained 1 or 2 cells each with barred windows, straw-stuffed bedding, and a bucket in the corner. Primitive, but effective. The sheriff's office sat adjacent, separated by a wall thin enough to hear the breathing of a restless prisoner at night. Uniforms were rare. Most sheriffs wore civilian clothes. Trousers tucked into boots, cotton shirts with rolled sleeves, suspenders, and a weathered hat to block the sun. The only thing that set them apart was the badge and the bearing. It was this quiet presence, this ability to remain calm amid chaos, that formed the final tool in the sheriff's kit: composure. In a land where life was often cheap and tempers ran hot, The sheriff's restraint was more powerful than any gun. He walked slowly, spoke softly, observed more than he acted, and it was this stillness, more than any symbol, that kept peace from unraveling completely. Now, as the tools return to their shelves, and the badge rests in its drawer, let us drift once more this time to the long, empty trails outside of town, and the quiet patrols that tested both body and will. The sheriff's world was not confined to the dusty limits of town. Beyond the last clapboard house and the rusting hitching posts, the land stretched wide an ocean of earth, sky, and solitude. This was where the trail began, and often where a sheriff's mettle was most quietly tested. When a horse thief vanished into the chaparral, or a fugitive was rumoured to be heading westward with a false name and a quick draw, the sheriff would saddle up sometimes with a deputy, sometimes alone. The leather creaked as he mounted, and with a soft cluck of the tongue, the horse began to move forward, hooves beating a slow rhythm across the prairie. The trail could be long, days at a time, sleeping under a canopy of stars, eating beans from a tin pot warmed over a flickering campfire. The wind was constant. It carried the scent of juniper and dry grass, sometimes of oncoming rain, sometimes of faraway smoke. Time passed differently out there. There were no clocks, only the changing angle of the sun, the shifting shadows of cactus and stone. A sheriff might ride for hours without speaking a word, the silence only broken by the whisper of his coat against the saddle or the far-off call of a hawk. He watched for signs, fresh tracks in soft soil, a broken twig, a cigarette butt still warm. The ability to read the land was not a luxury, it was survival. In the absence of roads or formal maps, experience was the guide. He could judge distance by the curve of a trail, time by the swell of a stream, but the trail was not always lonely. At distant ranches, he might stop for water or news. A ranch wife would offer him coffee, thick and bitter. Children might peek out from behind doorways, their eyes wide at the sight of the lawman. Often he was the only government they would see for months, a moving emblem of order in a world of isolation. Occasionally, the trail turned dangerous. A posse might be formed, a loose collection of townsfolk, hastily deputized and armed, their eyes burning with urgency. These men were brave, but not trained. The sheriff would ride at their head, his own calmness a counterweight to their fear. He reminded them to wait, to think, to aim true if it came to it, but to speak first, always. Confrontations on the trail were rarely dramatic. More often, they were negotiations. A man cornered in a canyon, his horse lamed. Words exchanged across a dry riverbed, hands held high. The sheriff, ever cautious, approaching slowly, always watching the eyes, not the hands. When arrests were made, the journey back was longer still. A prisoner tied to the saddle horn. No talk, just the quiet shuffle of progress under the weight of judgment. And there were times far more than the tales suggest when the man was not found, when the trail grew cold, when the sheriff rode back alone, the dust of failure clinging to his boots. The frontier was vast. The law could only stretch so far, but the sheriff still rode, not for glory, not for fame, but because he had been chosen to do so, because someone had to try. At night, as the fire cracked and the stars thickened overhead, he would lie back on his bedroll and listen, to the coyotes calling across the mesa, to the wind tracing the hills, to the slow, steady breath of his horse nearby. In that silence, the weight of the badge felt heaviest. Now, let us follow the sheriff back to town, not in pursuit this time, but into the courtroom where justice met ritual and where his word became law. In the small frontier towns of the American West, the sheriff's work did not end with the arrest. In many ways, it had only just begun. For every fugitive brought in, every drunkard calmed, and every thief apprehended, there followed a reckoning of another kind quiet, measured, and performed in rooms that echoed, not with gunfire, but with the solemn cadence of justice. The courtroom was rarely grand. More often, it was a multi-purpose hall, perhaps, the second floor above a mercantile, or the back room of a saloon hastily converted for the purpose. A flag stood in the corner. A crude gavel lay on a borrowed table. The judge, sometimes itinerant and appointed by the territory, sometimes a local elected man of standing, presided in plain clothes and with a pragmatic air. Benches were simple, windows open to the breeze. The jury, when one could be gathered, was made up of local townsfolk, ranchers, storekeepers, maybe a blacksmith or the schoolmaster. The sheriff would often stand nearby, arms folded, observing with the calm attentiveness of one whose duty extended into every corner of the room. He was not the judge, but his presence lent weight. In smaller settlements, the sheriff also acted as bailiff, maintaining order, swearing in witnesses, and ensuring the proceedings were carried out without disruption. His voice would echo low as he called names, his boots the only sound across the planks as he moved a prisoner to or from the dock. Evidence, if any, was simple: an eyewitness, a recovered item, a signed confession. There were no forensics, no legal teams with reams of paper. Testimony was king, character counted. A man's word spoken in front of peers was often the strongest tool either for conviction or defense. The sheriff's own words held particular gravity. He was presumed impartial, factual. His reports, handwritten and brief, were read aloud. His observations of the accused's behavior were noted. A nod, a furrowed brow, the tone with which he described and arrest these nuances influenced outcomes in subtle but profound ways. Sentences varied. Some resulted in fines or short stints in the local jail. Others brought the harsher judgment of forced labor, or in rare but grave cases, death by hanging, often carried out with grim ceremony in the town square, the sheriff overseeing with heavy eyes and a heart grown calloused through repetition. But many cases were more ambiguous. Disputes over land, accusations without witnesses, altercations fueled by drink and pride. In these, the sheriff's influence was felt more gently, in the background, through quiet conversation, through recommendations given not in courtrooms but in private, over coffee or a shared pipe. Justice on the frontier was not always blind, but it was always present, however imperfectly. There was also the matter of jail keeping. The sheriff, often alone, bore responsibility for the condition and treatment of those held. A prisoner might stay a single night or weeks while awaiting the travelling judge. The sheriff would bring food, fetch water, offer a blanket in the cold, or a word of counsel when asked. He held the keys not only to the cell, but to dignity or its denial, and sometimes a trial never came. Occasionally, prisoners escaped. Other times, they vanished into the desert night, aided by friends or unseen hands. The sheriff would ride again, or not. Justice in those cases faded like a trail lost in sand. Yet day after day the pattern continued. Arrest, testimony, verdict. It was not glamorous, it was not quick, but it was how law took root in the soil of new towns, how disputes were settled without duels, and how sheriffs became not merely keepers of peace, but stewards of fairness. Now, as the gavel's echo fades and the court empties once more, we turn to the shadows of the sheriff's mind. What thoughts lingered in the quiet hours? What burdens did he carry behind those watchful eyes? Let us listen now to his solitude. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the town grew still, the sheriff remained, sitting alone in the dim light of his office, or standing beneath the stars with the brim of his hat shadowing his brow. He faced the weight that no badge or bullet could lift: solitude. The life of a Wild West sheriff was never truly shared. Yes, he was a public figure spoken to daily, relied upon, even admired, but admiration is not companionship, and the responsibilities he bore were not easily understood by those around him. The decisions he made, the lines he walked, the burdens of justice, these carved quiet furrows into his face long before age did. Evenings often passed in silence. There were no radios, no bustling cafes to unwind in. Instead, there was a stove to be stoked, a letter half written, a ledger to update, the rustle of papers, the clink of keys, the distant barking of a dog. These sounds filled the stillness like old friends, present but not comforting. And always, there were doubts. Had he acted fairly that morning, breaking up the fight outside the saloon? Had he shown leniency when the law demanded firmness? Firmness when kindness would have sufficed? The law was clear, but life rarely was. And so the sheriff's greatest challenge was often not enforcing the law, but interpreting it in a world where right and wrong bled together like watercolor on a damp page. He had the final say in disputes where no witnesses stood, where stories conflicted, where reputations were all that remained. And while townsfolk might applaud his choices, the sheriff often slept with questions that no one else could answer. There were also ghosts, not spirits in the literal sense, but the memories of decisions made, of people who passed through the cell and were never seen again. The outlaw who shook his hand after being sentenced. The boy caught stealing bread, who cried as he was taken away. The man he never found. The man he found too late. These moments did not vanish. They lingered. Quietly, patiently. Still, with morning came duty once more. He would wash, dress, and step into the street with the same calm face, the same slow stride. No sign of turmoil, no complaint. Because this was the unspoken agreement between a sheriff and his town. He would carry their fears, their order, their conflicts, and they would trust him to do so without breaking. And when he eventually retired, or was replaced as all sheriffs, where his memory faded slowly, his name etched on a plaque, perhaps, his photograph yellowing in a backroom file, a few tales told by those who remembered, growing hazy with each telling. Yet even as the towns changed, the image remained, a solitary figure walking the main street, eyes alert but tired, hands at rest but ready, a symbol of balance between chaos and calm, a living bridge between law and the land. The sheriff's legacy was not carved in stone, but in the memories of small kindnesses, fair judgments, and the steadiness of his watch. And now, as the lantern's flame flickers low, we come gently to the end of our journey. And so, with the last ember glowing faint in the hearth, our journey draws to a close. The Wild West Sheriff is often remembered in myth-etched in the cultural imagination as a figure of action, of confrontation, of daring showdowns beneath high noon skies. But now, in this softened light, we see another truth emerge, a quieter one, a truth shaped not by legend, but by long days, steady hearts, and the quiet weight of duty. He was a man of routines and judgment, not gunplay, a man of long silences, of measured words, and quiet responsibility. He was not always right, not always brave, not even always respected, but he rose each morning to serve the people who needed him, to protect order where little existed, and to carry out the law with what grace and humanity he could manage. Today, that world is gone. The dirt streets have been paved, the frontier is fenced and mapped, the jails are modern, and the justice system infinitely more complex. But something lingers. Perhaps it's in the lone patrol car passing quietly through a sleeping neighborhood, or the low murmur of a dispatcher in the night, or the quiet conviction of someone who chooses still to wear a badge, not for glory, but for service. The sheriff of the Wild West no longer walks those dusty roads, but his echo remains, in every act of calm courage, in every choice to mediate rather than escalate, in every quiet guardian of order, watching from the sidelines so that others may rest. And now, as you lie in stillness, let your mind drift gently away from those wide frontier skies, away from the dry creak of saddle leather and the slow ring of spurs. Let the town dim behind you. Let the footsteps fade. You are safe now, far from the trials and trails of that old world. Close your eyes. Let the quiet carry you. Good night, traveller.